She came all the way from Boston with two babies in her arms and a man's name on a piece of paper, a man who had promised her a home. But the moment he saw those two children standing in the dust of an Arizona train station, he turned around and walked away without a single word of apology. No money, no explanation, just the heat, the silence, and two 8-month-old boys who had no idea their future had just been thrown away by a stranger. Eliza Whitmore had nothing, no family, no plan, no one in this town who knew her name. But she had one thing nobody could take from her. She was not going to stop. Like this video, comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far this story has traveled, and follow the channel so you don't miss what happens next. The train was 40 minutes late pulling into Dust Valley, which gave Eliza Whitmore just enough time to convince herself that everything was going to be fine. She sat near the rear of the passenger car, with her back against the wooden wall and both boys on her lap. Owen on the left, tucked against her arm, and Samuel pressed into her ribs on the right. They had been awake since before dawn, and fussy through most of Kansas, and now they were finally asleep, their small mouths open, their chests rising and falling in that particular rhythm that only babies have, the kind that makes the whole world seem slower and quieter than it actually is. She looked out the window and watched Arizona come at her in pieces. Red rock, flat sky, clumps of dry brush scattered across sand the color of old bone. Nothing like Boston. Nothing like anywhere she had ever been. A woman across the aisle caught her eye and glanced at the twins with the particular expression Eliza had learned to recognize over the past several weeks of travel. Not unkind exactly, but calculating, counting. Wondering what kind of woman showed up somewhere new with two babies and no husband visible. Eliza turned back to the window. She had the letter in her coat pocket. She had memorized most of it by now, not because she was sentimental about it, but because she had read it so many times during the journey that the words had worked their way into her head whether she wanted them there or not. I am a man of steady means and honest work. I have a good house and more land than one person needs. I would be grateful for a wife who is not afraid of hard living. His name was Gerald Foss. He was 41 years old. He raised cattle on a spread about 6 miles outside of town and had been writing to the Whitmore Domestic Placement Agency in Boston for the better part of 8 months before they matched him with Eliza. The agency had been straightforward with her, which she appreciated. They told her that frontier men looking for wives through placement services were often lonely in the particular way that comes from too many years of working alone, not dangerous, just worn down and hungry for something resembling a home. They told her to be practical, not romantic. They told her what to expect. What they had not told her, what she had not told them, in fact, until it was too late to matter, was that she had 2 sons, twin boys, 8 months old, the product of a brief and disastrous marriage to a man named Thomas Whitmore, who had died of fever in February before either of the boys had been born, leaving Eliza with his last name, his debts, and nothing else of value. She had written to Gerald Foss herself to tell him. She had done it 3 weeks before her departure, deciding that honesty was better than a shock at the station. His reply had arrived 2 days before she was scheduled to leave, and it had been short. The children are not what I expected, but I understand life is complicated. Come ahead. She had read that letter many times too. Come ahead. Not enthusiasm, not warmth, but not refusal either. She had packed her single trunk, bundled up Owen and Samuel, and gotten on the train. The station at Dust Valley was smaller than she had imagined. A platform of weathered boards, a ticket window, a handwritten sign nailed above the door that had faded so badly she could only make out the first 2 letters of the town's name. A water trough for horses stood at the far end of the platform. 3 men sat on a bench near the wall, not doing much of anything. 2 women in sun-bleached dresses stood talking near a wagon. Eliza stepped off the train with Owen in her left arm and Samuel in her right, her worn leather bag hanging from her elbow and banging against her hip with every step. A porter brought her trunk down and set it on the platform without being asked, and she thanked him, and then she stood there and looked around. She was looking for a man matching the description from the agency file. 41. Brown hair going gray at the sides, stocky build, usually wore a brown hat. There were 3 men on the bench. One was old and sleeping. One was young and watching her with mild curiosity. The third was somewhere in between, broad across the shoulders, wearing a brown hat pulled low. She walked toward him. He looked up when she was about 10 feet away, and she saw his face, sunburned, tired, with deep-set eyes the color of dry creek mud. He looked at her. Then he looked at Owen. Then Samuel. Something shifted in his expression, a small movement around the jaw, like a door swinging shut. "Mr. Foss?" she said. He stood up slowly. "Miss Whitmore." "It's a pleasure to meet you in person." She shifted Samuel to a more secure position and extended her right hand. He shook it. His grip was brief and businesslike, the kind of handshake that says, "I've acknowledged you," rather than "I'm glad you're here." There was a pause. "They're bigger than I thought," he said. He was looking at the boys the way a man looks at a fence post that's been put in the wrong place. "They're 8 months," she said. "They're a normal size for 8 months." "Yeah." He rubbed the back of his neck, looked at her trunk, looked at the boys again. "I need to be straight with you." She already knew. She knew it the moment she saw his face when he counted them. 1, 2, and something in his posture caved inward. "All right," she said, keeping her voice even. "I've been thinking on it since your letter. I have a working ranch, Miss Whitmore. I've got hands who come and go in a house that's not... It's not set up for..." He stopped. Started again. "I'm a man who lives alone. I thought I wanted a wife, and I'm not saying I didn't, but 2 babies. That's a different thing. That's a whole different thing than I signed on for." "You wrote to me," she said. "You said to come ahead." "I know what I wrote. I gave up my room in Boston. I spent 3 weeks on trains. I told you about the boys before I left." "I know." "And you said come ahead." He wouldn't look at her directly. His eyes kept going to the ground, to the platform boards, to some middle distance over her shoulder. "I'm sorry," he said. "I truly am, but I can't do it. I thought I could, and I can't." The words didn't hit her the way she might have expected. There was no collapse, no immediate panic. What she felt instead was a strange, terrible clarity, the kind that comes when something you were half afraid of finally just happens, and you don't have to be afraid of it anymore. "You're leaving," she said. "I'll pay for your ticket back." "I don't want a ticket back." He looked at her then, finally. He seemed surprised, which annoyed her. "I came here for a life," she said. "I'm not going back to Boston. There's nothing in Boston." "Miss Whitmore, you don't have to call me that anymore." She picked up her bag from the platform where it had slipped from her elbow. "We're not going to be married. You can go." He stood there for a moment, clearly uncertain what the correct response was to a woman telling him to leave when he was already trying to leave. Then he set some coins on top of her trunk. She didn't count them, but there were at least 6 or 7. Tipped his hat in a gesture that managed to be both apologetic and dismissive, and walked away. She watched him go. She didn't cry. Samuel woke up and started fussing. She sat on her trunk for a while. The platform cleared out. The train moved on. The 3 men who had been on the bench drifted off somewhere, and the 2 women with the wagon left, and the porter went back inside, and it was just Eliza and her boys, and the dry, relentless Arizona heat pressing down on everything. Owen woke up too, eventually. She fed them both from the bottle she'd prepared that morning, sitting there on her trunk with her skirt spread out and the sun hammering the back of her neck, and she thought about what she had. What she had. 1 trunk, which contained 2 dresses, a spare pair of shoes, the boys' things, a small amount of food she'd packed for the journey, and a book she hadn't opened since St. Louis. She had $9 and some coins in her purse, plus whatever Foss had left on the trunk. She had the clothes on her back. She had 2 8-month-old boys who couldn't walk or talk and needed feeding every few hours. What she did not have: a husband, a room, a job, anyone who knew her name, or any particular plan. She looked out at the main street of Dust Valley. It wasn't much. A dry goods store, a saloon, what appeared to be a barber shop, a building with a hand-painted sign that said, "Boarding, Meals." A few horses tied to a rail, a dog sleeping in the shade of an overhang. She could feel the heat coming up through the platform boards. "All right," she said quietly, mostly to herself, though Owen looked up at her when she said it. "We're going to figure this out." Owen seemed skeptical. He had a round, serious face that frequently looked skeptical. She kissed his forehead anyway. She got up, balanced both boys, picked up her bag, and walked to the edge of the platform to figure out how to get her trunk down. She was still working on the trunk. It was heavier than she remembered, and the platform was about 3 feet off the ground, when she heard boots on the boards behind her. "You need a hand with that?" She turned. The man standing there was tall, lean, somewhere in his mid-30s, with a face that had been weathered by years of outdoor work into something angular and careful. He wore a star on his chest. Not polished, not decorative, a plain, functional badge pinned to a plain, functional vest. "I'm fine," she said, which was not entirely true, but seemed like the correct answer. "That trunk's going to take your arm off trying to get it down from there by yourself." "I've managed heavy things before." "I'm sure you have." He didn't say it like he was doubting her. He said it like he actually believed it and was just pointing out the geometry of the situation. "I'm Sheriff Callahan, Wyatt Callahan. I saw you sitting out here and wanted to make sure you weren't in any difficulty." "I'm not in difficulty." He looked at the 2 babies on the platform beside her and the trunk teetering on the edge and her bag sliding off her shoulder and said nothing. She straightened up. "Eliza Whitmore. I've just arrived on the morning train." "I know," he said. "Small town. News gets around." A pause. "Was that Gerald Foss you were talking to earlier?" She felt her jaw tighten. "It was. And he's gone now." "He is." Callahan looked at the ground for a moment. "I see." "Sheriff," she said, "I appreciate the concern, but I'm not your responsibility. I'm going to get my trunk down from this platform and find a room somewhere and take care of my children. I don't need intervention." "All right," he said. She went back to the trunk. He stood there. After about 30 seconds, he said, "If you'll allow it, I can get the trunk down without it costing you anything and without you needing to be in my debt. It's just lifting." She stopped, looked at him. He had an honest face. Not a pretty face. It was too creased and sun-roughened for pretty, but honest. The kind of face that doesn't bother with performance. "Fine," she said. "Thank you." He got the trunk down in one clean motion, which told her he'd done heavier work than this. He set it on the ground without ceremony and stepped back. "There's a boarding house at the end of the street," he said. "Mrs. Alderman runs it. It's clean. She's not the warmest woman you'll ever meet, but she's fair." "How much does she charge?" $4 a week, meals included. Though she may ask more if you've got the little ones, extra laundry, extra noise. You'd have to talk to her." $4 a week. Eliza ran the arithmetic quickly. She had maybe $15, $16 total. 4 weeks. Less than that if Mrs. Alderman added fees for the boys. "I'll need work," she said. She said it plainly, without embarrassment. "I can cook, clean, sew, keep books. I've worked in a laundry before. I'm not particular about what the work is as long as it pays." He nodded like this was a practical statement of practical facts, which it was. "Mrs. Alderman might have use for help around the boarding house. It's worth asking. There's also the dry goods store. Hector Crane runs it. He might need someone for tallying and stock." "All right. You want help getting the trunk down to the boarding house?" She looked at the trunk, looked at the boys, looked at the distance. "Yes," she said, and it cost her something to say it, though she kept her face neutral. Mrs. Alderman was a woman in her late 50s with gray hair pinned severely back and an expression that suggested she had been mildly disappointed by everything life had offered her. She looked at Eliza, then at Owen, then at Samuel, then at the trunk. $4.50 a week, she said, on account of the noise and the washing. "I'd like to pay $3.50 and work off the rest," Eliza said. "I understand you may need help around the house. I'm a capable worker." Mrs. Alderman looked at her for a long moment. "What kind of experience?" "Cooking, cleaning, laundry, mending. I can manage a kitchen by myself or support someone who's running one. I kept accounts for a dry goods merchant in Boston for 2 years. I can do whatever you need done." "You've got babies." "I do. They sleep in the mornings and the late afternoon. I can work around them." Mrs. Alderman made a sound that wasn't quite agreement and wasn't quite refusal. "Trial period," she said finally. 1 week. You work, the work is good. We renegotiate." "That's fair," Eliza said. Callahan had stood back during this exchange, near the door, not saying anything. Eliza had noticed that about him. He didn't fill silences with himself. Most men she'd met did. "Sheriff," Mrs. Alderman said, as though noticing him for the first time. "You bringing me strays now?" "Just making introductions," he said. "Mm-hmm." She looked at Eliza again. "Room's on the second floor, end of the hall. You'll need to carry the babies up yourself. I've got a bad knee." "That's fine." The room was small. A narrow bed, a washstand, a single window that looked out over the alley behind the building. But it was clean, and it had a hook on the door that actually worked, and after 3 weeks on trains, it felt like the most private space Eliza had been in since February. She set Owen and Samuel on the bed and sat down beside them and let herself breathe for a moment. Just one moment. Then she thought about the money, $4.50 a week, but she was working some of it off, so perhaps $3 cash from her pocket, plus whatever she could earn. She needed to talk to this Hector Crane at the dry goods store. She needed to make the work at the boarding house substantial enough that Mrs. Alderman would keep her on past the trial week. She needed to figure out who else in this town might have use for her time. She also needed to get the boys on a better schedule, because the last 3 weeks had disrupted whatever small routine she'd built with them, and they were both fussy and unpredictable in ways that made everything harder. She lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling. It had a water stain in the shape of something she couldn't identify. She wasn't going to cry. She hadn't cried when Thomas died. She hadn't cried on the train. She wasn't going to start now over a man she'd never met and a town she'd known for less than 3 hours. She closed her eyes. Samuel put his fist in her ear. "I know," she said. "I know." But the next morning she was up before dawn. She had fed the boys at 2 and again at 4:30, and by 6 she was downstairs in Mrs. Alderman's kitchen before the landlady had come down, with the stove lit and water on and the first round of breakfast bread in progress. Mrs. Alderman came down at 6:30, stopped in the doorway, and looked around the kitchen. "I used what was already laid out," Eliza said. "I didn't go into the pantry without permission." "The beans need soaking by 8 o'clock if you want them for the noon meal," Mrs. Alderman said. "Already soaking." Another long look. Then Mrs. Alderman poured herself a cup of coffee from the pot Eliza had already made and sat down at the kitchen table without further comment. It was, Eliza would come to understand, the closest thing to a compliment the woman offered. She talked to Hector Crane that afternoon, leaving the boys with Mrs. Alderman, a negotiation that cost her an additional half-hour's work sweeping the front porch, and walking down to the dry goods store on the main street. Crane was a wiry man of about 50 with quick eyes and a restless quality, like a man who was always half thinking about something else. He listened to her proposal without interrupting, which was more than she expected. "I've heard you're Gerald Foss's intended," he said when she finished. "I was," she said. "I'm not anyone's intended now." He studied her. "You know your numbers." "I kept accounts for Dunbar Mercantile in Boston for 2 years. Full ledger work, inventory tracking, supplier correspondence." Boston. He said it like it was a foreign country, which she supposed it was. "I can show you my methods if you'd like to evaluate them." He tapped his fingers on the counter. "I can't pay much. $2 a week, 3 hours an afternoon, Tuesday through Saturday. You'd be doing the books and helping at the counter when it gets busy." $2.50, she said. "And if I bring the ledger current within the first 2 weeks, you keep me on." He almost smiled. "You haven't seen the ledger." "Bring it out." He brought it out. It was a disaster. Inconsistent entries, missing totals, at least 2 months of supplier invoices tucked loose inside the cover that hadn't been recorded at all. $2.50, he said. "Thank you," she said. She told none of this to Wyatt Callahan, because she hadn't asked for his involvement in any of it and didn't see why she should report back. But he came into the dry goods store on Wednesday afternoon while she was behind the counter working through a pile of invoices, and he stopped when he saw her there and looked at her for a moment with something on his face she couldn't quite read. "You moved fast," he said. "I don't have the luxury of moving slow," she said, without looking up from the invoice she was checking against the ledger. He bought what he came in for, some nails, a length of rope, and he left without saying much else. But she was aware of him in the way she was becoming generally aware of Dust Valley, its rhythms and its personalities. The way a small town is a kind of living thing you have to study before you can navigate it. There were people in Dust Valley who were kind. The woman who ran the milliner's shop, whose name was Caroline Reeves, stopped Eliza on the street one morning and admired the boys and asked their names and didn't say anything pitying or prying. The man who delivered ice for the boarding house always set the block down gently on account of the sleeping babies. A girl of about 16 who helped Mrs. Alderman on laundry day taught Owen to wave, or at least tried to, spending 20 minutes waggling her hand at him until he produced what might generously be called a small motion in return. There were also people who were not kind. She heard things, occasionally, not directed at her, but not entirely hidden either. That abandoned bride. Showing up with two bastards and expecting a man to take them on. You'd think she'd go back where she came from. She didn't know if Foss had said anything, or if it was simply the natural tendency of small places to fill in the gaps of a story with whatever fit their existing opinions. She ignored it. She had practice ignoring things. What she didn't expect, what caught her genuinely sideways, was Owen getting sick. It happened on the third week. He had been fussy the day before, more than usual, and she had assumed it was teeth, which they had both been starting to work on, but in the morning he was hot and quiet in a way that wasn't right. Samuel was fine. Owen wasn't fine. She sat with him in the room all morning, keeping him cool with a damp cloth, watching his breathing, which was normal but too fast. He kept looking at her with big, confused eyes, as though he couldn't understand why he felt the way he did, which was the most heartbreaking thing she'd ever seen in her life. By afternoon, she knew she needed the doctor. There was a doctor in Dust Valley, a man named Breck, who had a reputation for competence, if not for warmth. She carried Owen down to his office herself, walking fast in the afternoon heat, Samuel strapped to her back with a length of cloth she'd fashioned into a sling because she had no one to leave him with. Breck saw them right away, which she was grateful for. He examined Owen with efficiency and diagnosed a chest cold. Common in babies, he said. Nothing to panic about. Keep him cool and give him water and watch for fever above 103. He gave her a small bottle of something for the congestion. That's $2, he said. She had $3 in her pocket. She paid him. She walked back to the boarding house with Owen against her chest, and Samuel on her back, and her pocket nearly empty, and she was fine until she got to the room and closed the door behind her, and then she sat down on the bed and let herself feel it. Not cry. She still didn't cry, but just feel it for a minute. The weight of being the only person standing between these two small lives and everything that could go wrong with them. She sat there until Samuel started squirming, and then she put him down on the bed and lay Owen carefully beside him, and went to the washstand and splashed cold water on her face. There was a knock at the door. She dried her face and opened it. Wyatt Callahan was standing in the hall. He was holding a pot covered with a cloth. "Mrs. Alderman said one of the boys is sick," he said. "He's going to be fine. It's a chest cold. She made soup. I told her I was coming this way." He lifted the pot slightly, an explanation rather than an offer. She looked at him. He looked at her. He had the same quality she'd noticed at the station, that particular kind of steadiness that some men have, the kind that doesn't push, doesn't perform, just exists. "You can bring it in," she said, and stepped back from the door. He set the pot on the washstand and looked at Owen, who was lying on the bed looking miserable and small. "Poor kid," he said. "He'll recover," she said, because she needed to say it out loud. "Yeah," Callahan said. "He will." He said it with a certainty that didn't feel like false reassurance, which was different, and she noticed the difference even if she didn't say so. He left shortly after. She fed Owen some of the soup from a spoon, coaxing it into him by degrees, and she watched his breathing slowly settle through the evening, and she didn't sleep much that night. But by morning his fever had broken and he was looking at her again with his normal expression, which was serious and focused and extremely himself. She sat on the edge of the bed with the morning light coming through the window and both boys beside her, Owen recovering, Samuel wide awake and already trying to eat the corner of her sleeve. And she thought, "I am here. We are here. We are still here. It wasn't a victory exactly. It wasn't the life she'd imagined when she answered Gerald Foss's advertisement, but it was something. It was hers. She got up and went down to start Mrs. Alderman's breakfast. Owen's chest cold lasted 4 days, and by the 5th morning he was sitting up on the bed trying to pull Samuel's ear, which Samuel tolerated with the long-suffering patience of a boy who had been sharing a womb and then a world with his brother for the entirety of his short existence. Eliza watched them from the washstand where she was pinning her hair up and felt something loosen in her chest that had been knotted there since the moment she'd noticed Owen's too fast breathing. Not relief exactly. Relief was too simple a word for it. More like the easing of a pressure she'd been holding so long she'd stopped noticing it was there. She had $9 left. She counted them again after the boys were settled, as though the number might change if she approached it differently. It didn't. $9 and $3 still owed to Dr. Breck, though he hadn't come around asking for it. $4.50 a week for the room, minus the work she was trading off at the boarding house. $2.50 a week from Crane's dry goods store, which helped, but not enough. The arithmetic kept coming out the same way no matter how she arranged it. She went down to the kitchen and got breakfast started and told herself she'd figure it out, which was what she always told herself, and which had so far continued to be true, though the margin kept getting thinner. Mrs. Alderman came down at her usual time, poured her coffee, sat at her usual place, and watched Eliza scramble eggs for the 3 boarders who took morning meals. "The Carson place on the far end of town is looking for laundry help," she said. 3 days a week. Mrs. Carson's got 4 boys under 10 and a husband who works at the mill and no time to manage it herself. Eliza turned from the stove. "How do you know?" "She told me. Yesterday at the Mercantile." Mrs. Alderman set her cup down. "I may have mentioned you." It was, Eliza had come to understand, the way the woman operated. She didn't offer things directly. She arranged situations and let other people walk into them. "What did you tell her?" "That you were capable and not lazy, and that the babies would not be a problem during working hours." "And the pay?" $1.50 a week. It's not glamorous." It was also 6 hours a week of additional income, which brought her closer to stable without getting her there. But closer was better than not closer. "I'll go see her today," Eliza said. After the noon meal, Mrs. Alderman said, "I need you for the noon meal." 18th. She went to see Mrs. Carson after the noon meal. Mary Carson turned out to be a small, frantic woman in her early 30s with dark circles under her eyes and a baby on her hip and what appeared to be a permanent flour smudge on her left cheek. She looked at Eliza, looked at Owen and Samuel strapped into the makeshift double sling Eliza had fashioned from 2 lengths of cloth and laughed, not unkindly, but with the particular recognition of a woman who had been in approximately this situation herself. "Yours?" she said. "Both of them," Eliza said. "Lord." Mary shifted her own baby to the other hip. "Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 6 in the morning to noon. I'll have the washing ready for you the night before. You can bring them." She nodded at the twins. "Long as they're not running underfoot, they're not walking yet, are they?" "No, ma'am." "Good. We'll manage." She stuck out her free hand. $1.50, same day as Friday's work. Eliza shook it. "Thank you." "Don't thank me. I'm desperate." Mary said it without embarrassment. "You want some coffee before you go? I just made a fresh pot." Eliza almost said no. She had a habit of saying no to small things from people she didn't know well, because she'd learned that small things could become obligations if you weren't careful. But Mary was already turning back toward the kitchen, and Samuel had decided to be charming at that exact moment, producing a wide, gummy smile in the general direction of Mary's baby, who stared back at him with great seriousness. "All right," Eliza said. "Thank you." She stayed for coffee, and Mary talked, and Eliza listened, and that was how she learned most of what she actually needed to know about Dust Valley. Not from the sheriff or the landlady or the dry goods merchant, but from Mary Carson, who knew everything about everyone and had opinions about all of it. "Gerald Foss has done this before," Mary said, setting her cup down. Eliza looked up. "What do you mean, done this before?" "Not the exact same thing. But he sent away for a wife 3 years back, too. Woman from Ohio. She came all this way, and he backed out within a week. Said she talked too much." Mary shook her head. Man's got a romantic notion of company that doesn't survive contact with an actual person. He could have written to tell me not to come. He could have done a lot of things. Mary refilled her cup without asking. People around here have their opinions about what happened at the station. Don't let it bother you. It doesn't, Eliza said, which was mostly true. Half of them think you're foolish for staying. The other half are waiting to see what you do next. Mary looked at her directly. My opinion, for what it's worth, is that you're exactly what you appear to be, and this town could use more of that. Eliza didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing and drank her coffee. She started at the Carson place on Monday. Mary had not been exaggerating about the laundry. 4 boys under 10 generated a volume of dirty clothing that suggested they were actively trying to destroy their wardrobes, and the sheets and towels on top of that made for a full morning of hard work, even without the mending that Mary left in a separate pile with a hopeful expression. Eliza worked. She had always been good at work, not in the showy way of people who want credit for effort, but in the quiet, efficient way of someone who has understood for most of her life that the only things she could count on were the things she did herself. The washing got done. The mending got done. Owen and Samuel sat in a padded basket near the wash line and watched the sheets go up with the focused attention of babies confronting something large and flapping, which apparently required their full concentration. She was wringing out a shirt when she heard someone at the gate. Wyatt Callahan stood on the other side of it, not in any particular hurry, holding his hat in his hands. Making your rounds, she said, without stopping what she was doing. Something like that. He came through the gate, looked at the wash line, looked at the boys, looked at her. You're working at the Carsons now. 3 days a week. That's on top of the boarding house in Crane's place. I'm aware of my own schedule, Sheriff. He was quiet for a moment. That's a lot. It is what it is. She moved to the next shirt. Is there something you needed? No. He put his hat back on. I saw you walking this way this morning and wanted to make sure you found the place all right. She stopped ringing and looked at him. I can follow a street to the end of a town. I know that. Then why did you really come? He seemed to consider not answering, but then he said, Boss was in the saloon last night talking about you. She kept her face neutral. And? Nothing worth repeating. I just wanted you to know it happened and that I told him to find another subject. She stood there with a wet shirt in her hands and considered that. Wyatt Callahan was not a man who appeared to do things for show. He hadn't told her this to get credit for it. He'd told her because he thought she should know, which was a different thing entirely. Thank you, she said. Don't mention it. He moved toward the gate. Those boys got names, by the way. I keep forgetting to ask. Owen and Samuel. He looked at them in their basket. Owen looked back at him with his usual seriousness. Samuel was trying to eat a corner of the blanket. Good names, Callahan said, and left. The problem with Dust Valley, or one of the problems, because there were several, was that it had opinions. It was small enough that everyone knew everyone else's business, and large enough that there were factions within the knowing. People who told the story one way and people who told it another, and people who just repeated whatever they'd heard most recently. Eliza heard herself described at various times over the following weeks as pitiable, foolish, brave, shameless, resourceful, and desperate. Sometimes by the same person, in the same conversation, depending on which direction the wind was blowing. She learned to parse it. The women who had always lived on the frontier and built their lives through labor and practicality tended to look at her with something like recognition. The women who had come out to comfortable situations and made comfortable lives tended to look at her with something like pity, which she liked considerably less. The men mostly didn't look at her at all, except when they came into Crane's store and needed something tallied, and then they dealt with her quickly and professionally, and that was fine. There were exceptions in both directions. A woman named Ruth Hadley, who ran a small seamstress operation 2 doors from the boarding house, stopped Eliza on the street one morning and told her she'd heard she was good at mending and would she be interested in piecework. Nothing regular, just when orders came in. Eliza said yes. Ruth paid fair and didn't ask questions, which Eliza appreciated. A man named Douglas Pierce, who had a hardware business and served on the town council, made a point of saying, within her hearing, that the sheriff was spending an unusual amount of time looking after that woman from the train station, and someone ought to remark on it. She didn't know if Callahan ever heard about this, and she didn't bring it up. What she was watching, with the same careful attention she gave to Crane's ledger, was the town's temperature. She was taking its measure, the way you take the measure of any terrain you're going to have to cross, not with optimism or pessimism, just with accuracy. What she observed was this: Dust Valley was not a bad place. It was a hard place, in the way frontier towns were always hard, built by people who were still in the process of deciding what kind of place they wanted it to become. She had arrived as a complication, a young woman with 2 babies and no local ties, left at the train station by a man half the town knew. And complications made people uncomfortable because they demanded a response. You either helped or you didn't. You either made room or you didn't. And some people hadn't decided yet which way they were going to fall. She was going to make them decide by not going away. Owen and Samuel turned 9 months old on a Thursday in late April. Eliza marked it quietly, in the room at the boarding house, with no ceremony other than paying attention. She sat with them after the last feeding and watched them in the lamplight, Owen chewing industriously on the corner of a cloth she'd folded for him, Samuel pushing himself up on his arms with the intense concentration of a boy who had recently discovered that his limbs could theoretically be used for locomotion if he could just figure out the logistics. And she thought about Thomas. She didn't often let herself think about Thomas. There wasn't much productive in it. He had been charming and reckless and not well, had Thomas Whitmore. And the marriage had been a mistake that she'd recognized about 6 weeks after it happened and had been trying to manage ever since. She had not loved him the way she thought love was supposed to feel, but she had cared for him, and she had not wished for how things ended. His dying had not felt like a release. It had felt like a different kind of trapped. But the boys were his, and they were also entirely themselves, and she was glad of them, even on the days when glad felt like the wrong word for something so exhausting. She blew out the lamp and lay down between them in the narrow bed and listened to them breathe. It was Wyatt who told her about the job opening at the boarding house proper. Not the kitchen work she was already doing, but a formal arrangement, a paid position, to help Mrs. Alderman with the management of the place. He found her at Crane's store on a Friday afternoon, lingering at the counter after the last customer had left. "She won't offer it to you herself," he said. "She thinks it looks like charity." "Is it charity?" "No. She's got 3 new boarders coming in May, and she's already stretched with what she's managing. She needs the help, and she's too proud to ask for it directly, so she's been complaining about it to everyone in town except you." Eliza thought about this. "Why are you telling me?" "Because otherwise you'd go another 2 weeks not knowing, and she'd hire somebody she likes less and complain about them too." He picked up a tin of something from the counter and looked at the label without much interest. "If you ask her for more hours and make it about your needing the work rather than her needing the help, she'll say yes. You know her pretty well. She's been in this town longer than anyone except old Pete Devereaux, and Pete doesn't talk. Ida Alderman has been here since before the railroad." He set the tin down. "She's all right. She just needs things framed right." Eliza looked at him. He was doing it again. That thing where he provided information and then stepped back from it, let her do what she wanted with it, didn't push. She had met men who gave help and attached themselves to it, who gave you a thing and then expected something back, or at least expected to be looked at a certain way. Callahan didn't do that. He dropped the thing and walked away, and she wasn't sure yet whether that was a genuine quality or a very sophisticated approach to the same problem. "I'll talk to her tonight," she said. He nodded and bought his tin of whatever it was and left. She talked to Mrs. Alderman that evening, after the supper dishes were done, framing it exactly the way he'd suggested. And Mrs. Alderman said she supposed she could use the extra hands, and they settled on $1.50 for the additional hours, which brought Eliza's weekly income up to something that, when she counted it all out, was just barely enough to keep them stable. Not comfortable, not secure, but stable. She would take stable. May came in hot and dry. The new boarders arrived. 2 brothers named Garrett, who worked for the railroad survey crew, and a thin-faced man named Holt, who didn't offer his first name and kept to himself. And the boarding house expanded into a state of controlled chaos that Eliza navigated by getting up earlier and moving faster and learning which of the men had preferences she could accommodate without much extra work, and which were going to require managing. The Garrett brothers were easy. They ate everything, complained about nothing, and went to bed early. Holt was harder. He didn't eat much. He came and went at odd hours, and he looked at her sometimes with an expression she couldn't read and chose not to try. She told Callahan about Holt one morning when he stopped in for coffee, which had become a minor routine. Not every day, not at a set time, just occasionally, when he was passing and the morning was slow. "What about him, he asked. "I don't know, nothing specific. He just seems like someone who's waiting for something." Callahan drank his coffee. "I'll look into him. I'm not accusing him of anything. I know. I'll just look into him." He set his cup down. "Your instincts have been good so far." She looked at him across the kitchen table. "How would you know that?" "You read Crane's ledger in 10 minutes and told him his supplier in Tucson was billing him double for the cotton goods. You had Mrs. Carson's laundry schedule fixed by your second week without her asking." He shrugged. People who are good at paying attention are usually good at paying attention. She wasn't sure if that was a compliment or just an observation. With him, it was sometimes hard to tell. "Holt's last name is Reardon," he said. "I'll look into it." The thing about accepting help, Eliza was discovering, was that it was not the same as owing. She had believed, for most of her life, that receiving anything from another person created a debt. Not necessarily a bad debt, but a weight, something that shifted the balance of a relationship and required eventually to be settled. Her mother had believed this. Most people she'd known had operated on some version of this principle. Help was never free. It was a transaction. But Callahan kept helping her and then not collecting on it. And after 2 months of this pattern, she was beginning to think that either he was running a very long game or he genuinely didn't keep score. She asked him about it once, directly, because she found indirect questions unsatisfying. They were sitting on the front step of the boarding house in the early evening. He'd come by after his rounds, and she'd had a few minutes before the boys' last feeding, and they'd ended up just sitting there in the cooling air, watching the street settle into dusk. "Why do you keep doing things for me?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "What kind of things?" "The ledger, Mrs. Carson, Mrs. Alderman, Holt. Every time I need to know something, you show up with it." "Is that a problem?" "It would depend on why you're doing it." He looked at the street. A horse went by, unhurried. Somewhere a door opened and closed. "When you got off that train," he said slowly, and Foss walked away, "you didn't fall apart. Most people in that situation, the first thing they do is look for someone to hold them up. You didn't. You just looked at that trunk and started thinking about how to get it down off the platform." She waited. "I've seen a lot of people come through this town. Most of them, you can tell within a week whether they're going to make it. You could tell in about an hour." He glanced at her. "I'm not helping you because you need saving. I'm helping you because you're worth helping. There's a difference." She sat with that for a moment. "I'm not looking for a husband," she said. Not meanly, just clearly. "I know," he said, and there was nothing wounded in it. "I'm not volunteering for the position." She nodded. He nodded. They sat there for another few minutes in a silence that was, for the first time since she'd arrived in Dust Valley, not uncomfortable on either side. She went in to feed the boys. He went back to his rounds. Holt Reardon, it turned out, had outstanding debts in 2 counties, and a complicated history with a mining concern in New Mexico that Callahan was vague about, and she didn't press. He left the boarding house in the 3rd week of May, without notice and without paying his final week's rent, which made Mrs. Alderman furious and made Eliza feel vindicated and annoyed simultaneously. What he left behind in the drawer of his room was a leather-bound journal she found when she was making up the bed for the next tenant. She turned it over in her hands for a moment, then put it on the front shelf where lost items were kept, in case he came back for it. He didn't come back. She never read the journal. She thought about it once, wondered what kind of man kept a journal and what it might tell her about reading people. But in the end, she set it back on the shelf. Some things weren't hers to know. By the time June arrived, she had settled into something that felt cautiously like a life. The boys were growing. Owen had pulled himself upright against the leg of the kitchen table one morning and stood there for approximately 4 seconds, looking profoundly surprised at himself before sitting back down hard. Samuel had not achieved this yet, but was studying Owen's method with a focused intensity that suggested he was taking notes. They both ate everything she gave them and slept, most nights, in reasonable intervals, and they had developed personalities that were already distinct in ways that both fascinated and occasionally exhausted her. Owen was serious and watchful, the kind of baby who looked at new faces like he was gathering information before making any decisions. Samuel was social in a way that seemed almost willful, producing smiles and sounds at everyone who came near him with the generosity of someone who has decided the world is probably going to be friendly and is personally committed to making that prediction come true. The town had mostly stopped calling her that woman from the train station, at least to her face. She was Eliza now, or Miss Whitmore, or sometimes just the one who does Crane's books, which she found she preferred to the other options. Anonymity by competence. There were worse ways to earn your place. Caroline Reeves at the milliner's had started sending her mending work regularly, not just occasionally. Ruth Hadley offered her a small amount of sewing on a weeknight basis when the volume came in. She was still not comfortable, not by any honest measure, but the arithmetic had stopped terrifying her. She paid off Dr. Breck on a Thursday in mid-June. She went in the morning before the store hours started, knocked on his office door, and put the $3 on his desk. He looked at the money, looked at her. "You didn't have to rush on this." "I'm not rushing. It's been 2 months. A lot of people in your situation would have let it go." "I'm not a lot of people," she said, and left. She told Callahan about it that evening, not because she needed his response, but because she'd gotten into the habit of telling him things, which itself was something she was still deciding how she felt about. "Breck's paid off," she said. "Good." He was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone mostly cold, which was a thing he did, made coffee, and then forgot to drink it. "I have $12 saved beyond current expenses." "That's solid." "It's not solid. It's a start." She sat down across from him. "I want to save enough to put them in school when the time comes. Owen especially. He looks at things a certain way. He's going to want to read and know things." Callahan looked at her with something she'd started to recognize as his version of warmth, which was not demonstrative and didn't announce itself but was present. "You think a lot about their futures," he said. "I think about everything. It's how I'm built." She reached over and picked up his cup and went to the stove to warm it, which she'd also started doing automatically. "You gonna finish this tonight, or just let it sit there and haunt you?" "Probably haunt me," he said. "I'm not actually that fond of coffee." She turned from the stove. "Then why do you keep drinking it?" "Because someone keeps making it." She looked at him. He looked at her. There was something in the air of the kitchen that she didn't name and didn't address, just noted and set aside for later consideration. She put the cup back in front of him. "Drink it anyway," she said. "It's good for staying awake on rounds." He drank it. She sat back down. Outside, the last light of the June evening faded over Dust Valley, and the town went quiet in the way small towns do, settling into itself. And inside the boarding house kitchen, for the first time in a longer time than she wanted to calculate, Eliza Whitmore felt something that was in the neighborhood of all right. Not safe. Not certain. The boys were asleep upstairs, and tomorrow would bring its own ledgers and laundry and small battles, and there was no one who had promised her anything that she was inclined to believe. But she was here. She had made herself here. And the man across the table from her, who had never tried to rescue her and had simply refused to let the town's indifference become her own, was the closest thing to an ally she'd trusted in a very long time. She didn't say any of that out loud. She didn't need to. Summer in Dust Valley was not gentle. It arrived like something with a grudge, pressing down on the town from mid-June onward with a heat that turned the main street to a shimmer by mid-morning and made every task take twice the effort it would have required somewhere less punishing. The well at the east end of town ran low in July and had to be rationed, which made laundry day at the Carsons a particular kind of misery, and the boarding house kitchen in the afternoons was hot enough that Eliza had taken to doing the bread in the early morning before the stove had been lit for anything else. She adapted. That was the thing about hard conditions. You either adapted or you didn't, and not adapting wasn't something she was willing to consider with two boys depending on her. Owen had learned to walk in the first week of July, though walk was a generous word for what he was doing, which was more accurately described as controlled falling in a forward direction. He moved from one solid object to the next with intense concentration, a hand on the chair, a hand on the wall, a hand on Samuel's head, which Samuel accepted with admirable tolerance. Samuel himself was working on standing, spending most of his waking hours pulling himself up on whatever was nearest, and then looking around as though expecting applause. Eliza watched them and felt the particular mix of pride and terror that she'd come to understand was simply what motherhood felt like. The two things so tangled together you couldn't separate them and eventually stop trying. The town, meanwhile, was doing what towns do, shifting, slowly, in the way that it saw her. It hadn't been a single moment or a single event. It was an accumulation of small things, the way a riverbank changes not from one flood, but from 100 ordinary days of water moving over stone. She had been in Dust Valley for 5 months by July, long enough that people had stopped waiting to see if she'd leave and started simply accepting that she was there. She was part of the texture of the place now. She did Crane's books. She managed half the boarding house. She did laundry for Mary Carson and mending for Ruth Hadley and Caroline Reeves, and she did it all reliably, which turned out to matter more than almost anything else in a place where reliability was a currency. Mary Carson had become something close to a friend, or at least as close to a friend as Eliza had allowed anyone to get. They talked while she worked. Mary was constitutionally incapable of quiet, and Eliza had come to genuinely like her, the directness of her, the way she didn't soften things unnecessarily, but was also never cruel with the truth. "You know, people have stopped calling you the abandoned bride," Mary told her one Monday morning in late July, bouncing her youngest on her knee while Eliza worked through a pile of shirts. "I heard Hector Crane tell someone you were the best bookkeeper he'd had in 10 years of business." "He said that?" "Well, he said it to his brother, who told his wife, who told me, so it may have traveled some. But the general sentiment was accurate." Eliza wrung out a shirt and hung it up. "I wasn't trying to change how people saw me." "I know," Mary said. "That's probably why it worked." It was a thing Eliza had observed in other contexts, that the people who tried hardest to reshape their reputations usually failed at it, because the effort itself made people suspicious. She had not been trying to rebuild anything. She had been trying to keep her children fed and her rent paid, and the reputation had shifted as a consequence of that rather than as a goal of it, which didn't mean she was comfortable. Comfort was still a ways off. The first real test came in August, and it didn't come from the direction she'd been watching. It came from Douglas Pierce. Pierce was on the town council, as she knew, and he had a hardware business, and he had made no secret of his opinion that she was an irregularity in Dust Valley's social order, a young woman without a husband and without family connections, working multiple jobs and apparently becoming indispensable in ways he found difficult to categorize and therefore suspicious. She had been aware of his low-level hostility for months, and had not particularly worried about it, because hostility that stayed at the level of remarks made near but not at her was manageable. Then August came, and Crane told her that Pierce had raised a motion at the council meeting suggesting that the boarding house be subject to a new lodging ordinance that would require any establishment serving single male boarders to employ only married women in management positions. She heard about it secondhand from Crane, who had heard it from his brother, who attended council meetings. She sat with it for a full minute before she said anything. "He's targeting me specifically," she said. Crane looked uncomfortable. "The motion was worded generally, but it only affects me." He didn't deny it. Crane was a fair man, she had come to understand, but not a brave one. He would do the right thing when it didn't cost him much. She went home that evening and thought about it. Then she went upstairs, checked on the boys, both asleep, Owen with his hand tucked under his cheek, Samuel on his back with his arms flung wide like he was falling from a great height and had decided to enjoy it. And she sat on the edge of the bed and thought some more. She could fight it directly. She could go to the next council meeting and speak against the motion, which she was entitled to do. And she could make the argument that the ordinance was contrived and discriminatory, and she could probably win that argument on the merits. But winning an argument at a council meeting would make Pierce a public enemy, and public enemies in small towns were exhausting to maintain. or she could make the whole thing irrelevant. She went to see Mrs. Alderman in the morning before the breakfast rush, and she sat down at the kitchen table and put her hands flat on it and said, "I need to ask you something direct." Mrs. Alderman, who was measuring coffee, didn't turn around. "Ask." "Pierce is going to try to use a new ordinance to make it so I can't work here. You know about this?" A pause. "I heard. If he moves forward, what will you do?" Mrs. Alderman set the coffee measure down. She turned around slowly and looked at Eliza with the expression she used when she was making a calculation she didn't intend to share entirely. "What do you want me to do?" "I want to know where you stand before I decide what to do." The landlady pulled out the chair across from Eliza and sat down, which was unusual. She was not a woman who sat at her own kitchen table for conversations. She folded her hands. "I've had this boarding house for 19 years, she said. "I have managed it through 3 droughts, 2 fires on the main street, a robbery that took most of my savings in 1871, and a husband who died and left me better off than he'd left me while living, which tells you something. In all of that time, I have never had someone working in this kitchen who got up earlier than I did." She looked at Eliza steadily. "Douglas Pierce can go to the devil with his ordinance." Eliza held her eyes for a moment. "I need you to say that at the council meeting." "I know," said Mrs. Alderman. "I plan to." Fog. She told Wyatt that evening. He was at the boarding house for supper. He ate there occasionally, when the week had been long enough that cooking for himself had dropped off his list, and she told him while they were clearing the table after the boarders had gone. He was quiet through most of it. Wyatt was good at listening, which she had come to appreciate in the specific way of someone who had dealt with a lot of men who were not. "Pierce isn't going to let this go easily," he said when she finished. "Even if Ida speaks against it, he'll find another angle." "I know." "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to go to the meeting," she said. "And I'm going to say what I have to say, and Mrs. Alderman is going to say what she has to say, and I'm going to stand there and be the most boring, unobjectionable, sensible person in the room so that the only person who looks like he's causing a problem is Pierce." Wyatt looked at her across the table. "You've thought this through." "I've thought everything through. It's a habit." She stacked the last of the plates. "I don't expect you to come." "I wasn't planning not to." She looked at him. "It's not your fight. I'm the sheriff of this town. What happens at council meetings is my business." "That's not the reason." He met her eyes. "No," he said. "It's not the only reason." She didn't push further. She went back to the kitchen. Okay. The council meeting was on a Thursday evening. Eliza wore her better dress and put her hair up and left the boys with Mary Carson, who had offered without being asked. She sat in the 3rd row of the meeting room, a low-ceilinged space behind the post office that smelled of old wood and lamp oil, with her hands in her lap and her back straight. Pierce presented his motion with the particular confidence of a man who believes he has already won. He spoke for about 10 minutes, couching everything in terms of propriety and community standards and the appropriate management of establishments serving the public. He never used her name, which was both a cowardice and a tactic. 2 council members nodded along. One looked at his hands. Then Mrs. Alderman stood up. Eliza had seen the woman manage difficult boarders and difficult mornings and difficult deliveries of supplies that arrived wrong, and she had understood that beneath the flat effect and the minimal expression was a person with a significant amount of internal architecture. But she had not seen her angry before. Ida Alderman was not loud when she was angry. She got quieter and more precise, and she looked at Douglas Pierce the way you look at a structural problem that you've identified and intend to fix. She spoke for approximately 5 minutes. She covered the 19 years of her business, the quality of the work that had been done in her establishment since March, the fact that the proposed ordinance would have no practical effect on any other business in Dust Valley, and her opinion of the motivations behind it, which she expressed without profanity, but also without softening. She finished by saying that if the council wished to regulate her establishment, they were welcome to come and review her books, her kitchen, her rooms, and her record of tax payment, which was complete and on time going back to 1862, and she sat back down. There was a silence. Then Eliza stood up. She had prepared what she wanted to say, had written it out, and then put the paper away and memorized what mattered and let the rest go. She kept it short. 3 minutes, maybe 4. She said that she was a widow and a mother who had come to Dust Valley seeking honest work and a decent life for her children. She said that she had found both, and that the people of this town had been the reason. She said that she employed no deception, owed no debts she wasn't working to pay, and asked nothing of Dust Valley except the opportunity to be useful in it. She said that if the council believed an ordinance targeting a specific individual was an appropriate use of their authority, she trusted the town would judge that decision accordingly. She sat down. Wyatt, who was standing along the side wall with 2 other men in the unofficial observer capacity that his position allowed, said nothing and did nothing except be present, which was exactly right. Pierce's motion failed, 4 votes to 1. He was the one. Outside afterward, in the cooling evening, Mary Carson appeared from somewhere and grabbed Eliza's arm. 3 minutes, she said. You said everything that needed saying in 3 minutes, and you didn't cry once. I would have cried at least twice. Crying wouldn't have helped, Eliza said. I know that, but I still would have done it. Mary squeezed her arm. Come have coffee. I want to hear everything. The boys are fine. Jim's with them. Come. Eliza went. She drank Mary's coffee, which was always slightly too strong, and let herself be talked at for a while, which was what Mary Carson did when she was relieved, and it was oddly comfortable to sit in someone's kitchen and not have to manage anything for 20 minutes. Wyatt didn't come that evening. She hadn't expected him to, and she didn't feel the absence of him as a lack, more as a presence she'd accounted for and filed appropriately. She walked back to the boarding house in the late evening, and Mrs. Alderman was still up, which was unusual for her. Thank you, Eliza said, for what you said tonight. I said what was accurate, Mrs. Alderman replied. She was at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, and she looked tired in the way of someone who has spent energy they'd been saving for something and had no regrets about spending it. Don't make it sentimental. I won't. Eliza sat down across from her. Can I ask you something? You can ask. Why did you give me the trial week back in March? You didn't know me. You had no reason to take a chance on someone showing up with 2 babies and no references in this town. Mrs. Alderman looked at her cup for a moment. My sister came west in 1858, she said. Her husband's plan fell through 3 days after they arrived in New Mexico. She had a baby on her back and $40. She managed. A pause. Not everyone helped her manage. Eliza said nothing. I don't do charity, Mrs. Alderman said. I don't believe in it as a principle. What I believe is that people who are worth something ought to have a fair shot at proving it. She looked up. You proved it. We're square. She got up, took her cup to the counter, and went upstairs. Eliza sat in the kitchen alone for a while, in the good dark of the house, listening to the town outside settle into its nighttime self. Gerald Foss came back to Dust Valley at the end of September. She heard about it from Crane, who heard it from someone at the feed store, and she received the information with the same neutral expression she used for most information, and then carried it around for the rest of the afternoon while she worked through the week's invoices, turning it over in the back of her mind, the way you turn over a stone to see what's underneath. She had thought, occasionally, about what she might feel when this happened. She had always assumed it would happen. Small towns, circular lives, the limited geography of the frontier. She had expected anger, or the cold version of anger that she was more familiar with. She had not expected what she actually felt, which was something closer to tired curiosity. She wanted to know what he thought he was doing, and she didn't particularly want to see him, and these 2 feelings coexisted without resolving. He came to the boarding house on a Wednesday morning. She was in the kitchen when she heard Mrs. Alderman's voice from the front. That particular flat tone the woman used when she was controlling herself, and then a man's voice she recognized even after 6 months, and then footsteps. She kept working. She was rolling dough, and she finished rolling it out before she turned around. Foss stood in the kitchen doorway. He looked roughly the same, stocky, weathered, the brown hat in his hands now rather than on his head. He looked like a man who had rehearsed what he was going to say and wasn't entirely sure it was going to hold together. Miss Whitmore, he said. Mr. Foss. She turned back to the dough and cut it. I'm in the middle of work. You have a few minutes. A pause. She heard him shift his weight. I came to explain, he said. All right? What I did at the station? The way I did it, it wasn't right. I know that. I know you know that. What I don't know is what you'd like me to do with the information. Another pause. He hadn't expected this, she could tell. He'd expected either anger or forgiveness or some more dramatic reception, and her continuing to cut dough was not part of whatever he'd prepared for. I've been feeling bad about it, he said. That's your business. She moved the cut pieces to the pan. Was there something specific you wanted to say, or did you come to describe your feelings? I wanted to. He stopped. I wanted to apologize. Properly. She wiped her hands on the cloth at her waist and turned to look at him directly, for the first time since he'd come in. He looked older than she remembered, or more tired, which could be the same thing. You apologized at the station, she said. It didn't help much, but you said it. You came all the way in here on a Wednesday morning to say it again, and I appreciate that it cost you something to do it. So, all right. You've said it. He looked at her. That's it? What else would there be? He turned his hat over in his hands. I thought you might, I don't know, be angrier. I was angry, she said. In March, April, most of May. I'm not angry now. She turned back to the pan. I have children to raise and work to do and about 20 other things that matter more than being angry at you, Mr. Foss. No offense meant. None taken, he said slowly, as though he was still working out whether that was better or worse than what he'd expected. Is there anything else? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You've done well. People in town say so. I've done what needed doing. She slid the pan toward the back of the counter. As have most people. He put his hat on. I'm sorry, Miss Whitmore, genuinely. I believe you, she said. Have a safe ride back. He left. She heard the front door and then nothing. Mrs. Alderman appeared in the kitchen doorway where he had been standing and looked at her. You all right? She asked, which from Ida Alderman was the equivalent of a lengthy expression of concern from anyone else. I'm fine, Eliza said. And she was, mostly. There was a bruise somewhere under the fine. She could feel its shape, if not its sting, but it wasn't bleeding and it didn't need attending to. She had touched it, and it had told her something about herself, and she had filed that away and she would move on. Good, said Mrs. Alderman. The bread needs another hour. I know. She told Wyatt about it that evening. He was at the boarding house for supper again. This had become a regular enough thing that Mrs. Alderman had stopped commenting on it, which was its own form of acknowledgement. She told him factually, without drama, and he listened the same way he always listened. How do you feel? He asked when she'd finished. Fine, she said. Mostly fine. There's a part of it that still hurts, but not the part I expected. Which part? She thought about how to say it. I expected to feel vindicated, like he came back and I was standing here with a life I'd built, and that was supposed to feel like winning, and it felt like something, but not that exactly. She looked at the table. I think the part that still hurts is not about him at all. It's about arriving here and being the person who got left. Not because I'm still that person. I'm not. But the memory of standing on that platform with the boys, it just sits somewhere. I don't think it ever entirely goes away. Wyatt was quiet. That's honest, he said finally. I try to be. I know. He looked at her. The kitchen was warm with the last of the supper heat, and the lamp was lit and the boys were asleep upstairs. And it was one of those evenings that felt very present, very specific, like you could press it like a flower and carry it somewhere. Eliza, he said. It was the first time he had used her given name without her permission, and they both noticed it, and neither said anything about it. Yes, she said. I'm not going to say anything tonight that you'd need to answer. He chose his words carefully, which she had come to know was what he did when something mattered. I just want you to know that whatever you did in March and April and all the months since, it wasn't nothing. What you built here, the way this town looks at you now versus the way it looked at you when you got off that train. He paused. I've been here 12 years. I've watched a lot of people try to make something of themselves in this place. I haven't seen many do it the way you did. She held his eyes. Thank you, she said. I'm not telling you to make you feel good. I'm telling you because it's true, and someone should say it. I know the difference, she said. That's why I'm saying thank you. He nodded. They sat for a moment in the particular quiet of two people who have said something true and don't need to add to it. October came, and with it a change in the air that Eliza was grateful for. The first real break in the heat since May. Mornings that were cool enough to breathe without effort. Evenings that turned dark earlier and brought something resembling peace with them. The boarding house was full, which meant more work, but the work was familiar now, which made it lighter. Owen had graduated from controlled falling to something recognizable as walking, and the world had opened up to him in ways that were both wonderful and catastrophic. He walked into everything, the table legs, the door frame, the edge of the porch step, with the same thoughtful expression as though cataloging information. Samuel had followed 3 weeks behind him, walking earlier than most babies of his age would, which Eliza suspected was sheer competitive response to his brother's precedent. She was keeping a small notebook now, a habit she'd started in September, recording the things they did. First steps, first words, the specific and irreplaceable details that she knew she would not remember accurately if she didn't write them down. Owen's first clear word had been no, which was entirely consistent with his personality. Samuel's first clear word had been something that sounded like more, also consistent. She had written these things down and kept the notebook in the bottom of her trunk, and she did not show it to anyone, not even Mary Carson, because it felt like the private record of something she didn't have language for yet. The accumulation of evidence that they were real, that they were hers, that she had managed to keep them alive and growing in a place that had not promised her anything. Plus, on a Saturday morning in late October, she was at the dry goods store when Caroline Reeves came in and looked at her with the expression of someone carrying news she was deciding how to package. "There's talk," Caroline said, in the way of someone who has not yet decided whether the talk is good or bad. "About what?" Eliza finished tallying the column she was on before looking up. "About you and the sheriff." Caroline set her basket on the counter. "People have noticed he takes his suppers at the boarding house more often than not." Eliza looked at her steadily. "He pays for them." "Angle. I thought you should know." "What angle does my eating supper in the same room as the sheriff give Douglas Pierce?" "On its own, nothing. But people have started to—" "Eliza, people like you now. This town likes you. And anything that shifts that picture matters, because Pierce knows the best way to come at you now isn't the ordinance. It's your reputation." She put her pen down. She thought about what Wyatt had said. "I'm not volunteering for the position." And about the kitchen evenings and the cold coffee and the name he'd used for the first time last month and hadn't gone back from. "I appreciate the warning," she said. "I'm not telling you to stop," Caroline said quickly. "I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it. I'm just saying that if there's something there, it's worth thinking about the timing." "There's nothing there," Eliza said. Caroline looked at her for a moment. "All right," she said in the tone of someone who does not entirely believe this but is choosing to accept it. Eliza picked her pen back up. "Was there something you needed from the store?" "Mike." She turned it over for the rest of the day, and the next day, and didn't arrive at anything conclusive, which was itself a kind of conclusion. She was not good at not knowing what she thought about things. She was usually precise about her own mind. The fact that she couldn't give a clean answer when she held up the question of Wyatt Callahan told her something. She was not falling in love with him. Or she was not going to let herself be falling in love with him, which she was aware was a different statement. She had 2 children and a life she'd built with her own hands, and very little margin for error and love. The kind that required something from you, the kind that changed the architecture of things, was a risk she didn't have space for. But she also noticed when he wasn't there. That was the honest part of it, the part she couldn't argue herself around. She noticed the kitchen evenings when they didn't happen. She noticed when a whole day passed without him stopping by, which was less frequent than it used to be because his stopping by had become ordinary, which was exactly the problem. She was in the yard behind the boarding house on a Sunday afternoon, watching Owen and Samuel navigate the packed dirt with the focused attention of 2 small people discovering that the world had edges, when she heard the gate. Wyatt came through it, which was not unusual. He stopped when he saw the boys, who both looked up at him, and Owen, who assessed every new face before committing to a response, put his hands up, the unmistakable gesture of a child who wants to be picked up. Wyatt crouched down to his level. "Hey, bud." Owen said something that was not quite a word and grabbed Wyatt's thumb. Samuel toddled over immediately, unwilling to be left out of anything. She watched from where she was standing. Wyatt sat down on the dirt of the yard, right there in his work clothes, and let both boys climb on him, which they did with enthusiasm and no regard for his dignity, and he looked up at her over their heads with an expression she recognized as the closest thing to uncomplicated happiness she'd seen on his face. Something shifted in her chest. She let it shift. She filed it away. She would deal with it in the right time. "You're going to have dirt all over you," she said. "Already do," he said, entirely unbothered. Owen sat down hard on his foot and looked surprised. "Normal," Eliza said. "He does that." "Good to know." He settled Samuel more securely against his side and looked up at her again. "I heard Foss is leaving town again, heading to Yuma." "Good," she said. "Thought you'd want to know." "I did. Thank you." They stayed like that for a while, her standing, him sitting in the dirt with both her boys anchored to him like small, determined barnacles. And the October afternoon light came down over the yard, and the town made its ordinary sounds around them, and nothing was resolved and nothing needed to be resolved. And for right now, that was enough. It had been, she reflected, a long way from the train platform in March to this yard in October. Long in distance, long in effort, long in the kind of emotional mileage that doesn't show up in any ledger she'd ever kept. She had come to Dust Valley with 2 babies and no plan and a man's broken promise, and she had made something from it, not because she'd been given much to work with, but because she'd refused to work with nothing. The town that had watched her with calculation and pity and occasional hostility had in the space of 7 months rearranged itself around her presence. She was not its center, she was not trying to be, but she was woven into it now in the way that useful, reliable, present people become woven into places, and the weaving had gone both directions. The town into her as much as her into the town. She was not the woman who had been left on the platform. She was the woman who had stayed. Samuel grabbed a fistful of Wyatt's hair and pulled with great conviction, and Wyatt made a sound that was almost a yelp, and Owen looked at his brother with what could only be described as respect, and Eliza laughed, a real one, the kind that arrives without warning and doesn't ask permission. And the sound of it went up over the yard and into the cooling October sky and meant something she didn't try to name. She would name it later. There was time. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in November, which was otherwise an unremarkable day. Cold enough in the morning to see your breath, warm enough by afternoon to feel like the desert was still making a point. Eliza was at Crane's store working through the week's receivables when the postboy dropped a bundle on the counter and she sorted through it without much thought until she saw the Boston postmark and the name on the return address. Hargrove and Ellis, attorneys at law. 14 Pemberton Square, Boston, Massachusetts. She set the other letters aside. She had not had correspondence from Boston in 8 months. She had not expected any. She had left Boston as cleanly as she could manage, which was not very cleanly given the debts and the circumstances, but she had written to the necessary parties and settled what could be settled and considered that chapter closed. She opened the letter at the counter, which she would not normally have done. She kept her personal business private as a matter of habit, but something about the weight of the envelope made her not want to wait. It was 3 pages, written in the dense, careful language of legal correspondence, and she read it twice before she understood what it was saying. Thomas Whitmore's uncle, a man named Edward Whitmore, had died in September. Edward Whitmore had been the last surviving member of the elder branch of the Whitmore family, and he had died without a wife and without children of his own, and his estate, which was not enormous but was substantial, comprising a property in the Beacon Hill neighborhood and a modest investment account held through a Boston financial house, had passed, under the terms of his will, to Thomas's surviving heirs. Thomas had no surviving heirs except Eliza and the boys. The letter requested her presence in Boston to execute the necessary documents, settle the estate administration, and take possession of the assets, which the attorneys estimated at somewhere between $4,000 and $6,000 in total value after fees. She read it a third time. $4,000. Possibly $6,000. She stood at Crane's counter with the letter in her hands and the noise of the store around her. A customer asking about feed prices, the bell above the door, Crane's voice from somewhere in the back, and she felt the floor shift under her in a way that had nothing to do with the floor. She put the letter in her pocket, finished the receivables, and went home. Well, she did not tell anyone that day. She needed to sit with it first, to turn it over until she understood what shape it was, because she'd learned by now that information that seems simple on the surface almost never is. $4,000 to $6,000. The boarding house property had sold for $800 when Mrs. Alderman's husband bought it in 1861. She made just under $7 a week across all her work combined. $4,000 was more than 10 years of her current income, sitting in a Boston financial house waiting for her signature. She sat on the edge of the bed that night after the boys were asleep and did the arithmetic in every direction she could think of. And what she kept arriving at was this. If the estate was real and the numbers were accurate, she and Owen and Samuel would never be a grocery bill away from disaster again. She could buy property. She could put money aside for their schooling. She could stop counting every coin before she spent it. She could go back to Boston and live in Edward Whitmore's house on Beacon Hill and give her sons a city life and never roll another man's laundry or keep another man's ledger for wages. She lay down on the bed and stared at the ceiling and felt the weight of that possibility, which was enormous and also cold somehow, in a way she hadn't expected. She told Wyatt the next evening. He came to the boarding house at his usual time and found her in the kitchen staring at the letter on the table in front of her, and he sat down across from her and waited. She slid the letter across. He read it. He was a careful reader. He didn't skim, he went through it, and she watched his face as he did. There was no significant change in his expression, which was typical of him, but she had learned to read the smaller things, the slight tightening around the eyes, the way his jaw settled. He set the letter down. "That's a substantial amount of money," he said. "Yes." "You have to go to Boston to execute the estate?" "The attorneys want me there in person. The property transfer requires signature, and there are several accounts." She looked at the letter. "It would be a few weeks, minimum, possibly longer if the estate is complicated." "Is it likely to be complicated?" Thomas's family was not simple in any direction they approached things. So, yes, probably. He was quiet for a moment. "When do they need to know?" "I need to respond within 30 days. Travel time from here to Boston is 3 weeks at minimum, more with the boys." She paused. "I'd need to leave by early December to arrive before the window closes." December. That was less than a month away. She had known this when she calculated it, but saying it out loud made it more specific, more real, with edges. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I'm thinking a lot of things," she said. "I'm thinking that this money would change what's possible for Owen and Samuel in ways I haven't been able to consider before. I'm thinking that going back to Boston means weeks away from everything I've built here." She looked at him directly. "I'm thinking about what I come back to." He held her eyes. "You're thinking about whether you come back." It was not a question. He had read the things she'd been circling. "It would be easier," she said slowly, "to stay there. The boys would have more opportunity, better schools, a house already paid for. I wouldn't have to start over again. I'd just be continuing in a different place." "That's true," he said. "You're not going to argue against it. It's not my argument to make." He put both hands flat on the table, the way he did when he was making sure he said something right. "Eliza, that money is yours and those boys are yours and the life you build with them is yours. I don't get a vote." "I'm not asking for a vote," she said. "I'm telling you what I'm thinking because you're the person I tell things to. That's different." He looked at her. Something moved in his expression, quiet and careful, and he didn't try to cover it. "Then here's what I think," he said. "I think you should go to Boston. Execute the estate, take the money, take the time to see what that city looks and feels like now that you have options in it instead of nothing. And then I think you should decide from there, from a place where you actually know what you're choosing between." She had expected him to say something like this. It was the kind of thing he said, measured, fair, putting her interest before his own. She had expected it, and it still landed with weight. "And if I decide to stay in Boston," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Then I'd want to know Owen and Samuel are somewhere good." He paused. "And I'd be sorry." Just that, not dramatic, not demanding. I'd be sorry. 2 words that carried everything without performing it, and she felt them the way you feel something true. In the chest, before your mind catches up. She looked at the letter again. "I need to tell Mrs. Alderman. She's not going to be happy." "No," Eliza agreed. "She's not." Mrs. Alderman was not happy. She received the information with the stillness of a woman who has learned that the things she depends on have a habit of becoming complicated, and she sat with it for almost a full minute before she said anything. "How long?" she asked. "I don't know exactly. 4 weeks at minimum, possibly 6 or 8. That's the bulk of winter." "I know. I can't hold your arrangement open indefinitely." "I know that too." Eliza looked at her steadily. "I'm not asking you to. I'm telling you what's happening because you deserve to know. Whatever you decide about the position is your decision." Mrs. Alderman looked at her. "You're coming back." "I don't know that yet. I'm telling you that you're coming back." The landlady said it in the tone she used for statements of fact rather than opinion. "This city you came from. I've never been to Boston, but I know enough. It'll feel like the right answer until you remember why you left." "I left because I had nothing there." "And now you'll have money there. That's different from having something there." She stood up. "I'll manage while you're gone. Martha Hess has been looking for work. She'll do." A pause. "But your room will be here." Eliza looked at her. "The room will be here," Mrs. Alderman said again, more quietly. "Don't make it into something sentimental." Mary Carson cried, which was entirely in character, and then wiped her face briskly and started making practical suggestions about the train route and which cities had the best stopover options for traveling with 2 toddlers, which was also entirely in character. "Write to me," she said. "Write to me every week, or I will assume the worst." "The worst being?" "That you've been seduced by cobblestones and stayed." Mary looked at her. "You won't stay." "You don't know that." "I know you. You built something here. You don't build things and then walk away from them." Eliza said nothing. "Do the boys have warm enough things for a Boston winter?" Mary asked, pivoting without transition. "Because Owen's going to need a proper coat. The wool one he has is only good to a certain temperature, and Boston in December is not Arizona in December." She let Mary redirect her into practicalities. It was easier. It was also necessary. There was a great deal to organize in less than 3 weeks, and the emotional weight of it was something she could carry better if she kept moving. She wrote to Hargrove and Ellis. She arranged for the train. She packed what they would need and left the rest in the room, which Mrs. Alderman had insisted she not fully vacate. And on a cold morning in the first week of December, she stood on the platform at Dust Valley Station with 2 toddlers and 1 trunk, and felt the specific strangeness of leaving a place by the same method she'd arrived. The platform looked different from this side of it. The same weathered boards, the same faded sign, the same water trough. But she was not the same person who had stood here in March with Gerald Foss's rejection still fresh and $9 between her and nothing. She was aware of the difference, but she was not sentimental about it. Sentiment was not going to help her navigate Boston or the estate attorneys or the next several weeks. Wyatt was there. He had not announced that he would be, but she had not been surprised to see him. He helped her get the trunk onto the platform. Owen immediately reached for him, which had become a consistent habit over the past few months, and Wyatt picked him up without being asked and let the boy look around from the additional height with his usual serious expression. "He likes the view from up there," Eliza said. "Smart kid." Wyatt looked at Owen, then at her. "You've got everything?" "Everything I need." Samuel was clutching her hand and looking at the train with a mixture of excitement and wariness that was, she thought, the appropriate response to something large and loud. "Right when you get there," Wyatt said. "So I know you made it." "I will." He looked at her. The morning light was flat and cold, and the train was making its preliminary sounds of impatience, the kind of mechanical groaning that meant they had perhaps 5 minutes. "Eliza," he said. "I know." she said. He looked at her. I know, she said again. I haven't decided anything, and I meant it when I said that what I come back to matters. So, she stopped. She was not good at this part. She was good at ledgers and laundry and standing up in council meetings and not crying when things were hard. And she was not good at standing on train platforms and saying what she meant when what she meant was complicated and could not be edited into a clean column. Don't decide anything until you've been there, he said. See what it is. And if it's good, then it's good. He said it simply, without bitterness. I want you to have good. She looked at him for a moment, and then she did something she had not planned to do, and that surprised her even as she did it. She stepped forward and put her hand against his jaw for a second. Just that, a brief and deliberate touch, and then stepped back. He stood very still. All right, she said. She picked up Samuel, took the trunk handle, and walked toward the train. Boston in December was gray and cold and smelled of coal smoke and the sea. And when they pulled into South Station after the long journey east, Eliza stepped onto the platform and felt the particular dislocation of returning somewhere you used to know as a different person. The city was the same. She was not. The attorneys had arranged a room at a respectable boarding house near their offices, smaller than Mrs. Alderman's, quieter, with a landlady who smiled more but listened less, and she settled the boys in and spent the first 2 days simply getting her bearings, letting the rhythms of the city come back to her. The noise level was different. The pace was different. Everything moved faster here and with a kind of purposeful anonymity that she had once found comfortable and now found slightly airless. The offices of Hargrove and Ellis were on the 4th floor of a building that smelled of old paper and ambition, and the attorney who handled the Whitmore estate was a careful, gray-haired man named Mr. Hargrove Sr., who had been managing the family's affairs for 30 years and had, apparently, a great deal of patience for difficult family situations. He laid out the estate over the course of 2 meetings. The property at Beacon Hill was smaller than she had imagined from the letter, a narrow row house with 3 floors and a garden that had gone to seed, but it was solid and in a decent neighborhood, and the deed was clear. The financial accounts totaled, after fees and taxes, $4,312. There were also some personal items of Thomas's uncle that had been boxed and held for the heir, which turned out to be a small amount of jewelry, some books, and a portrait of a woman no one had been able to identify. She looked at the numbers. There's no encumbrance on the property? She asked. None. It was purchased outright in 1851 and has been maintained current on taxes. Mr. Hargrove folded his hands on the desk. Mrs. Whitmore, I want to be frank with you. This is a sound estate. The property alone, in the current Boston market, is worth at minimum $2,000. You and your children would be in a comfortable position. I understand that. Will you be returning to Boston permanently? It would affect how we structure the transfer documentation. She looked at the deed in front of her, the property address, the recorded dimensions, the formal language of ownership. She tried to imagine living in that narrow house on Beacon Hill, walking these streets every day, putting Owen and Samuel into Boston schools, and watching them grow up in this city. I'm not sure yet, she said. Of course. Take the time you need. She took the time. So, she went to see the house on a Thursday afternoon, leaving the boys with the boarding house landlady who had offered, walking the familiar streets of Beacon Hill with the cold coming off the river and the sky the particular flat white of a Boston winter day. The house was on a quiet street. It was not grand, 3 floors, like she'd been told, with a blue door that had weathered to something closer to gray, and a fanlight above it that had 1 cracked pane. The garden, visible through the iron gate, was dead and overgrown, the kind of garden that needed someone to care about it before anything could grow back. She stood on the pavement and looked at it. She tried to feel something definitive. She tried to feel the pull of it, the obvious rightness of a woman who had spent 9 months working herself to the bone, now having a roof over her head that couldn't be taken away, and enough money to stop the arithmetic permanently. What she felt instead was the memory of October light in the yard behind the boarding house, Owen sitting down hard on Wyatt's foot, Samuel pulling hair, herself laughing without planning to. She stood there for a while longer, just to be thorough, and then she went back to the boys. Well, she wrote to Wyatt that week. She had promised she would, and she did, and she wrote a longer letter than she'd planned. Something about the city and the attorneys and the house, and something, toward the end, that she hadn't entirely planned to include, but that wrote itself before she could edit it away. The estate is real, and the numbers are real. I've seen the house. It's a decent house on a decent street, and I could make a life here, and the boys would have good schools and a stable home. I know that. I also know that I walked around this city for 3 days waiting to feel like I belong here, and it didn't come. Maybe it would with time. But the feeling I keep coming back to is that belonging is not about familiarity. I was familiar with Boston before I left. That's not the same thing. I think you know the difference between those two things. I think Dust Valley taught me the difference. I'm not sure I'm done learning it. She almost didn't send it. She read it over twice and it said more than she usually let herself say in writing, which was less controlled than speaking, and she was a person who preferred control. But she sent it because it was true, and because he would understand it without requiring her to explain it, which was not nothing. His reply came 10 days later, quick for the mail, and it was shorter than hers, which was typical. I won't tell you what to decide, but if you're looking for a place where the belonging went both directions, I think you know where that is. Owen and Samuel know it too. Take all the time you need. The town will be here. And then, at the bottom, 3 words after his name. So will I. She read it at the boarding house table with Owen on her lap and Samuel crawling under her chair, and she sat with it for a long time. The estate work took the full 4 weeks she had estimated, and then part of a 5th. There were documents to sign and accounts to transfer and the property deed to record under her name, and a tax matter that required 2 additional meetings with Mr. Hargrove and a separate attorney who specialized in such things. And she handled all of it with the same methodical patience she brought to Crane's ledger because the arithmetic was more complex but the principle was the same. You went through it line by line until it was right. She listed the Beacon Hill house with a property agent. Not to sell it immediately, she wasn't sure yet, but to let, which would generate income while she decided what she wanted to do with it. The agent, a brisk woman named Mrs. Fenton, who wore her business sense plainly, told her the property would let quickly at $20 a month, which was a significant sum and which Eliza noted in her mental ledger with the satisfaction of a number that worked. She kept the financial accounts in Boston, managed through Hargrove and Ellis, with a quarterly disbursement arrangement that meant she wouldn't need to move the money until she decided what to do with it. She was standing in Mr. Hargrove's office on the day the final documents were signed, looking at the copies she'd keep, and he said, "You've handled this efficiently, Mrs. Whitmore. Your husband's family was not, historically, efficient." "I know," she said. "What will you do now?" She put the documents in her bag. "I'm going home," she said. He raised his eyebrows slightly. "To Boston?" "No," she said. "West." She wrote to Mrs. Alderman from Boston before she left. She wrote to Mary Carson. She wrote a brief note to Crane. She did not write to Wyatt again. She had said what she needed to say in the letter, and the rest was better said in person, in the same kitchen where they'd said most of the true things. The journey back was 3 weeks with a stopover in St. Louis when Samuel developed a slight fever that turned out to be nothing, but cost her 2 days of watching and worrying and running the same calculations she'd run when Owen was sick in April. The particular mathematics of a mother who is entirely alone with 2 small people and cannot afford to be wrong about what they need. He was fine. She got back on the train. She watched the landscape change from east to west with a different eye than she'd watched it going the other direction, 8 months and a lifetime ago. She had been going toward something unknown then, and afraid, and trying not to show it. Now she was going back toward something known, and the feeling was steadier and different from relief. More like orientation, like a compass settling. Owen slept on her shoulder for most of the last day. Samuel watched the desert come back through the window with the focused attention of a child who had strong opinions about the world and was updating them accordingly. She looked out at the red rock and the flat sky and the dry brush and thought about what she was returning to. Not the money, which was in Boston being managed by competent lawyers, and not the security, which she had built herself over 9 months of 6-day weeks, but the specific texture of a specific place. The smell of the boarding house kitchen in the early morning, the sound of the main street settling at night, Mary Carson's too strong coffee, Mrs. Alderman's version of affection, which was so compressed it was almost undetectable, but entirely real. And Wyatt, the cold coffee he didn't drink, the way he sat in the dirt of the yard and let her boys climb on him. So will I. She was not going back because the money hadn't been real, or because Boston hadn't been an option. She was going back because she had, somewhere in the 9 months since she stepped off a train into Gerald Foss's rejection, built a life that was hers, in the way that a house you built yourself is yours differently from a house you inherit. Every plank of it, she knew. Every joint. She had put each piece in herself, and she knew which ones were solid and which ones still needed work. And that knowledge was not something you could buy or inherit or receive as settlement from a dead man's estate. The train pulled into Dust Valley at just past noon on a Thursday in January. She stepped onto the platform. The air was cold and dry, and the sky was the particular blue of winter in the desert, sharp and clear. And she stood there for a moment with Owen on her hip and Samuel beside her, holding her hand and her trunk at her feet. She had left this platform in December as a woman who hadn't decided anything. She was returning as a woman who had. The platform was not empty. She had not told anyone the exact day she was arriving because she had not been exactly sure herself. But Dust Valley was small enough that news of the incoming train was news, and she was not entirely surprised when she saw the figure standing near the end of the platform. Not waiting, exactly, or not performing waiting, just present, in that way he had that looked like he'd happened to be there, and you could take it however you wanted. Owen saw him first. He made the sound he'd been making for the past month when he spotted someone he was pleased to see. Somewhere between a word and an announcement, and reached forward with both arms. Wyatt came toward them. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and 9 months of everything that had happened between them sat in the cold January air and was not spoken and did not need to be. "Good trip?" he said. "Long," she said. "Productive." "You settled it." "All of it." She shifted Owen, who was still reaching. "He wants you." He took Owen, who grabbed his collar immediately and started inspecting it with the focused interest of a boy who found everything about this person worth examining. "You came back," Wyatt said. "I came back," she said. He looked at her steadily, the way he'd looked at her across every kitchen table and every difficult silence for the past 3 seasons. And he did not ask her why, because he already knew, and she had already told him in the letter, and the rest of it was time. Samuel, who had been patient long enough, let go of her hand and walked purposefully toward Wyatt's knee and attached himself to it. "Hi, bud," Wyatt said, without looking away from her. "He does that," she said. "He finds what he wants to hold on to." "Smart kid," Wyatt said, same as he'd said in October. Same words and different weight. She picked up her bag. "Take me home," she said. It was the first time she had used that word for Dust Valley, and she felt it settle into the right place when she said it, the way a word does when it is finally the accurate one. He picked up her trunk without being asked. They walked off the platform and into the town, the 2 boys between them and the cold winter light on the street, and Dust Valley received them back the way a place receives people who have chosen it over somewhere easier, without ceremony, without fanfare, with the simple and sufficient fact of being exactly where it was, waiting to be chosen again. Mrs. Alderman had kept the room. Not just technically kept it in the way of someone who had stripped the bed and remade it with fresh linen and put a small fire in the grate before the train arrived, though she would deny the fire specifically if asked, citing only that the chimney needed clearing and it was practical to do both at once. Eliza noticed the fire. She noticed the fresh linen. She said nothing about either, which was the correct response, and Mrs. Alderman accepted her return with a nod and a pointed remark about Martha Hess's deficiencies with the bread, which was the warmest welcome the woman was capable of offering. January settled around them. The boarding house was quieter in winter. One of the Garrett brothers had moved on with the survey crew, and a traveling merchant had taken the back room for 2 weeks and then departed. And the reduced noise gave Eliza a kind of breathing room she hadn't had since the summer. She used it to think and to plan, and to let the decision she had made on the train platform in Boston fully land in her body the way decisions sometimes need to land before they are real. She had chosen this, not out of desperation, not because the alternative was nothing. The alternative had been real and solid and financially sound. She had chosen Dust Valley because belonging, she had finally understood, is not the same thing as being familiar with a place. It is the accumulated weight of being known by it, being changed by it, having changed it back, even slightly, even in the small radius of a boarding house kitchen and a dry goods ledger and a town council meeting where she had stood up and said her piece in 3 minutes flat. Boston had known a version of her that no longer existed. Dust Valley knew the one that did. She and Wyatt did not rush anything. That was perhaps the most honest thing she could say about the weeks that followed her return, that they did not rush because neither of them was built for rushing, and because what was between them had been accumulating for the better part of a year and did not need to be forced into a shape before it was ready. They had the kitchen evenings again, and the cold coffee he still didn't drink, and the yard on weekend afternoons when the weather permitted, where Owen and Samuel treated him with the proprietary confidence of children who have decided someone belongs to them. She watched Wyatt with her boys and felt something she had spent a long time being careful about letting herself feel. It was not the feeling of watching a man be kind to children. She had seen men be kind to children as a performance, as a signal, and she had learned to read the difference. What Wyatt did was not a signal. He simply engaged with them. He talked to Owen like Owen's opinions mattered, which Owen clearly believed they did, and he had a tolerance for Samuel's physicality, the grabbing, the climbing, the cheerful disregard for personal space. That was not patience in the gritted teeth sense, but something closer to genuine delight. She told him this one evening in February, sitting at the table after the boys were in bed. "You actually like them," she said. He looked up from the cup he wasn't drinking. "What made you think I didn't?" "Nothing. I'm saying I see that you do. It's different from being polite about them." "I've been around a lot of kids," he said. "You can tell pretty fast which ones are going to be interesting people." He glanced toward the stairs. "Owen's going to argue with everyone for the rest of his life, and he's going to be right about half the time, which is better than most. And Samuel—" a small pause. "Samuel is going to make people feel like they matter to him, and mean it, which is rare." She looked at him. "You've thought about this." "I think about a lot of things," he said. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. Just that. He turned his hand over so his palm was against hers, and they sat like that for a moment, and it was quiet and warm and entirely without performance, and she thought, this is what I came back for. Not this moment specifically, but the kind of thing this is. "I need to say something," she said. "All right. I need you to understand that I'm not choosing you because I need someone. I needed someone in March, when I got off that train, and I didn't choose anyone. I built something instead." She looked at him directly. "I'm choosing you because you are specifically you, and because I want my boys to grow up knowing what it looks like when a man is present without needing to be admired for it, and because the kitchen is better when you're in it." A pause. "That last part is about the coffee." He looked at her for a moment. "The coffee I don't drink. Somebody has to make it." His hand tightened slightly around hers. "Eliza." "Yes. I've been trying to figure out how to ask you something for about 3 months." "I know," she said. "Ask it. Will you marry me?" Not performed, not a speech, just the question, plainly, the way he said everything that mattered. She looked at him. He looked back. There was nothing on his face that was waiting for the right answer in the way of a man who needs to be told yes. There was just Wyatt, honest and steady and present, giving her the question and standing back from it. "Yes," she said. He nodded once, like she had confirmed something he'd been trying to calculate and had finally gotten a clean figure on. "Good," he said. She laughed. He almost did. "That's your proposal," she said. "Good. You said yes to it." "I did," she agreed. He raised her hand and held it for a moment, and it was not poetry. It was not the frontier romance she had once imagined when she was young enough to imagine things like that. It was better than that. It was two people who had looked at each other clearly and said, "Yes, this, you." So, they were married in March, not the anniversary of her arrival. She had not planned it that way, and she would not have planned it that way if she'd thought of it, because she was not a woman who built meaning into coincidences. It simply fell in March because that was when everything was ready and the weather cooperated and the justice of the peace. A man named Collins, who had done this job for 15 years and brought to it the efficient warmth of a professional who genuinely liked people, had an opening on a Saturday afternoon. The ceremony was in the main room of the boarding house, which was not a grand venue, but was the room that meant something, and Mrs. Alderman had done something to it with early spring branches from the scrub that Eliza could see had taken effort she would also deny if pressed. Mary Carson was there, visibly emotional, with her husband Jim, who looked bemused and supportive, in the way of a man who has been married to Mary Carson for 11 years, and has learned that bemused and supportive is generally the right answer. Crane was there, and Ruth Hadley, and Caroline Reeves. A few of the people from the council who had voted against Pierce's ordinance, Dr. Breck, who arrived late and stood in the back. Owen and Samuel attended in the matching shirts Mary had made for them, which they both treated with the suspicion usually reserved for new and constraining situations. Owen spent most of the ceremony looking at Collins with careful assessment. Samuel spent it trying to get down from Wyatt's arms, and when he finally succeeded, he sat on the floor at their feet and played with his own shoes, which were apparently more interesting than the legal proceeding happening above him. Eliza wore her better dress, which she had let out slightly to accommodate the past year of good meals, a fact she noted without distress, because she had earned those meals in every literal sense. And she stood beside Wyatt and listened to Collins say the words, and said her own words back and meant them in the precise, unembellished way she meant everything. When it was done, Wyatt leaned down and kissed her, which was brief and honest and drew a sound from Mary Carson that could only be described as triumphant. "Finally," Mary said, and her husband patted her arm. Mrs. Alderman produced a cake, which she had made herself and would describe only as a practical response to the occasion requiring some form of refreshment. The cake was excellent. They moved into the house Wyatt had on the east side of town, a solid adobe structure with 3 rooms and a porch that caught the afternoon light, and a yard with actual grass in one corner, which Owen discovered with the focused intensity of a boy encountering a new texture, and spent 20 minutes investigating on hands and knees. Samuel walked the perimeter of the yard 3 times like a small surveyor establishing boundaries, and then sat down in the corner with the grass and looked satisfied. Eliza stood on the porch with a cup of coffee and looked at the yard and the boys in it and the flat desert sky above everything, and let herself be still for a moment. She had a house, a real house, not a room in someone else's house. The rooms needed work. The kitchen had a drafty corner she'd already identified, and the larger bedroom needed its plaster redone, and the yard required significant attention before it would be what she wanted it to be. But they were hers and fixable, and she had both the will and, for the first time in her life, the resources to fix them. The money from the Boston estate sat in its account, growing at a modest rate, and she had decided to leave the Beacon Hill house on let for now and use the income toward the ranch property she and Wyatt were considering on the land 6 miles east of town. Not Foss's land, not anywhere near Foss's land, but a piece of territory with decent water access and grazing potential and enough space that the boys could grow up with room to run. The ranch was not immediate. It was a plan, which was different, and she was accustomed to plans. She did not stop working. This surprised some people, who seemed to think that marriage and money together would naturally resolve a woman's professional ambitions the way water resolves salt. Eliza was not salt. She reduced her hours at the boarding house. Mrs. Alderman had hired Martha Hess permanently by then, and their arrangement had shifted naturally into something more advisory. But she kept the books at Crane's because she found the work satisfying in the way that accurate numbers are satisfying, and because she had by now completely reorganized his supplier relationships and was not going to leave the system without someone who understood it. She also started, in the spring, teaching arithmetic to the children of 3 families in town who had no formal schooling options. It had begun when Mary Carson mentioned that her oldest, a serious boy of 8 named Patrick, was struggling with numbers, and did Eliza know anyone who might help? She did. She knew herself. It grew from there, the way things grew when you were actually good at them, and word got around. By summer, she had 7 students on 2 afternoons a week, including 2 girls whose families had not initially seen the point and had been persuaded by their daughters, who had opinions about the matter. She charged what families could pay, which varied considerably, and made no issue of the variance. Wyatt came home one evening to find her at the kitchen table with a stack of copybooks and a pencil behind her ear, and Owen sitting beside her looking at the numbers with the expression of a boy who is beginning to understand that this thing his mother does has its own internal logic and is interested in that logic. "Is he learning arithmetic?" Wyatt asked, hanging up his hat. "He's watching me mark," Eliza said. "He can tell when something's wrong. He doesn't know why yet." Wyatt crouched down to Owen's level. "What's wrong with that one, Woot?" he asked, pointing at a page with a corrected error. Owen pointed at the correction mark without speaking, then looked at Wyatt to see if this was the right answer. "That's right," Wyatt said. "Good eye." Owen looked pleased in his contained, serious way and went back to watching. Wyatt stood up and went to put the coffee on, because he had understood very early in the marriage that coffee happened in this kitchen, whether he intended to drink it or not, and had decided to make peace with this. "Pierce has resigned from the council," he said, from the stove. Eliza looked up. "When?" "Today. Effective end of the month." He didn't turn around. "Apparently he's relocating to Tucson. Business opportunities." She looked back at her copybooks. "I hope Tucson suits him." "That's generous." "It's not particularly generous. I just don't have the energy to feel anything specific about Douglas Pierce anymore." She marked another page. "He was a small obstacle. Small obstacles pass." "You weren't saying that last August." "No," she agreed. "Last August I was calculating how to keep him from taking my job. But that's done now, and he's going to Tucson, and I have 7 students and a house and the best bookkeeping system Crane has ever had. So," she set the pencil down, "Tucson is welcome to him." Wyatt laughed. A real one, which still surprised her slightly when it came, not because it was rare exactly, but because it was unguarded, and unguarded was not his default. She had come to understand that his laugh was something he gave when he forgot to hold it back, which was its own kind of trust. The summer that followed was the first summer in Arizona that Eliza experienced as something other than a battle to be managed. It was still hot. It was always going to be hot. The desert did not negotiate on this. But she moved through the heat with a different body now, a body that had spent 2 summers in this climate and knew its rhythms. She knew when to do the hard work and when to slow down. She knew which hours the porch was bearable and which were not. She knew that the late afternoon light, when it came through the kitchen window at a certain angle, turned everything inside the color of warm stone, and that this particular light had come to mean home to her in a way she had no more efficient word for. Owen and Samuel turned 2 in the early summer. She marked it as she had marked everything significant in the past year, with attention, without ceremony, with the private recording in the notebook she still kept in the bottom of her trunk. Owen's second birthday entry read, "Knows 20 words, prefers declarative sentences, has opinions about hats." Samuel's read, "Knows 32 words, uses them primarily to negotiate, has his brother's hat." Wyatt read the notebook once, by accident, when he was looking for something else in the trunk and it fell open. She found him at the kitchen table with it, not reading ahead, just looking at what he'd already found. And his expression was one she hadn't seen before, something careful and full and not quite ready to be spoken. He set the notebook down when she came in. "You've been keeping this since March," he said. It wasn't a question. "Since April," she said. "March I was too busy surviving." He was quiet for a moment. "There's an entry in here from May." He didn't read it aloud. She remembered what it said. "Owen's cold broken. Both boys asleep. Someone brought soup. The sheriff is not as simple as he seems. I was keeping records," she said. "Of me?" "Of everything. You were part of everything." She took the notebook and put it back. "Don't read ahead." "There's more?" "Quite a bit more." She closed the trunk. "You'll live it. You don't need to read it first." He looked at her in the way that still, a year and several months into knowing him, had the capacity to catch her off guard. That direct, unhurried attention that said, "I see you specifically, not the version of you that's performing, not the version that's managing something. You." "Eliza," he said. "Yes." "I want you to know something." "All right." He leaned forward with his elbows on the table. "When I found you on that platform in March, I wasn't doing a job. I mean, I was, technically, but that's not why I walked over to you." He looked at his hands for a moment. "I walked over to you because you were looking at that trunk like it was a problem with a solution, and you were going to find it. And I thought, that person has something in her that this town needs to see." She sat down across from him. "You thought that in the first 5 minutes?" "I've been wrong about people," he said. "I've been badly wrong, once or twice, and it costs things I won't get back, so I pay attention." He looked up. "I was not wrong about you." She held his eyes. There were things she could say, that she was not the person he'd assessed on the platform, or rather that she was, but also more and differently so, that the woman who had stood there calculating how to get a trunk off a 3-foot ledge had been operating on very thin reserves, and might have looked more capable than she felt. She could say that his confidence in her had mattered even when she'd insisted it didn't, that being seen by someone steady had made it easier to be steady herself. She said something simpler. "You weren't wrong about yourself either," she said. "I'm aware that you had a before, that there are things you don't talk about that cost you. I don't need to know the specifics. I just want you to know that whatever you were before you were the sheriff of this small, unremarkable town, what you are now is exactly right." He didn't say anything. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, same as she had done in February, and they sat like that for a while in the warm summer kitchen. And outside, Samuel was shouting at something in the yard, and Owen was presumably assessing it, and the coffee was getting cold. And it was not a perfect moment, because perfect moments don't exist, but it was a true one, and true was better. The ranch took 2 more years to become real. She did not rush it, because she had learned that the things worth building take the time they take, and resist being forced. She and Wyatt went out to the land 6 miles east of town on a Sunday in the early fall of that second year, just the 2 of them and the boys, who were almost 4 by then, and running ahead through the dry grass with the reckless confidence of children who have grown up knowing they will be found. The land was not pretty in the way that land in other parts of the country was pretty. It was hard and dry, and the color of everything in it leaned toward brown and rust and dusty green. But there was a line of cottonwoods along the water access that gave shade in the afternoon. And the ground was sound, and she stood in the middle of it and thought about what it could become with intention and work. "This is it," she said. Wyatt stood beside her, looking at the same land. "You sure?" "I'm sure." She shaded her eyes and looked toward the cottonwoods. "We'll put the house there, east-facing, to catch the morning and avoid the afternoon heat. The barn on the north side." She turned. "The grazing is better on the south and west. We could start with 20 head and expand when the water situation is more developed." He was looking at her with that expression again. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "I'm just watching you build something." She looked back at the land. Owen and Samuel were visible near the cottonwoods, Owen crouching to look at something on the ground, Samuel standing over him observing. She watched them for a moment, her boys, almost 4 years old, in the desert light of Arizona, entirely at home in a place she had built for them out of refusal and stubbornness and a particular kind of love that had never been gentle. She had not given them the life she'd imagined when she answered Gerald Foss's advertisement. She had given them something she hadn't been able to imagine then, because you cannot imagine what you don't yet know is possible. She had given them a town that knew their names, and a man who sat in the dirt with them, and a mother who had never once let the arithmetic of their survival stop moving, who had made a life in the desert out of nothing but the refusal to accept nothing as an answer. Owen found whatever he'd been looking for and held it up. Something small, a stone or an insect or a piece of something, too far to see. Samuel looked at it and said something, and Owen considered the response, and they resumed moving toward the cottonwoods. She watched them and thought about what she would tell them someday, when they were old enough to want to know the story. Not the romantic version, not the version where everything happened for a reason and worked out as it was always going to work out. The true version, that their mother had arrived in this place with very little and no promise of anything, and that she had been afraid more often than she had let anyone see, and that fear had not stopped her because stopping was not a thing she was willing to do, and that this, the land and the family, and the life they were standing in the middle of, was not fate or luck, but the direct result of choosing, every single day, to keep building. There was a lesson in that, but she was not going to call it a lesson. Lessons implied a tidy moral at the end of a contained experience, and what she had was not contained. It was ongoing, still being written, still accumulating. What she had was closer to a practice, the daily, unglamorous, specific practice of not accepting the first story someone told you about who you were or what you were worth. Gerald Foss had told her a story on this platform. Douglas Pierce had told her a story in a council motion. The women who whispered that abandoned bride had told her a story. Even the version of herself that had sat on that trunk in the heat of March and run the arithmetic on $9. Even that Eliza had been telling herself a story about the edges of what was possible. She had rewritten all of them. Not by being extraordinary. She was not extraordinary. She was competent and determined and occasionally right about things and often wrong about others. And she had made mistakes she didn't talk about and carried losses that didn't show on the outside. She had rewritten the stories by simply declining to stop. Wyatt put his arm around her shoulders, easy and without announcement, the way he did things. "You're thinking," he said. "I'm always thinking." "Anything worth sharing?" She looked at the boys in the cottonwood shade and the land that was going to become something and the wide, flat Arizona sky that had nothing in it but light and space and the specific quality of a place that was done apologizing for what it was. "I'm thinking that I should have bought that notebook sooner," she said. "There are things from March I can't remember clearly anymore." "What kind of things?" "Specific things. How cold the water at the station was. What Mrs. Alderman's face looked like when I showed up in her kitchen at 6 in the morning." She paused. "How you looked when you offered to take the trunk down. I remember the fact of it, but not exactly the look." He was quiet for a moment. "What do you remember?" "I remember thinking you had an honest face," she said. "And that honesty in a face doesn't mean much on its own because dishonest people learn to wear it too. And then I watched you for 6 months, and it turned out the face was accurate." "High praise," he said. "It is actually," she said. "It's harder to find than you'd think." Owen called from somewhere near the cottonwoods. Not distress, just announcement, the particular shout of a child who has found something interesting and expects the world to be informed. Eliza cupped her hands around her mouth. "What is it?" A pause. Then Owen's voice carrying clearly in the dry air. "Rock!" "A good one?" she called back. Another pause, apparently occupied by assessment. "Yes!" Wyatt made the sound that was almost a laugh. "Let's go see the rock," she said. They walked toward the cottonwoods across the land that was going to be theirs, in the afternoon light that was already the color of the kitchen at home, and Samuel ran toward them when he saw them coming with the arms out, full-body confidence of a boy who has never doubted he is going to be caught, and Wyatt caught him, same as always, same as he had been doing since a Sunday afternoon in a yard when she had stood there and let herself feel something she hadn't named yet. She had names for all of it now. Owen showed them the rock. It was a good one, reddish, flat on one side, with a vein of something lighter running through it that caught the light if you held it at the right angle. He held it at the right angle, deliberately, to show them. "Keep it," Eliza said. He closed his hand around it and looked satisfied. This was what nobody told you about building a life in a hard place. That the hard place became, with time and intention and the accumulation of ordinary days, a place where a small boy could find a rock and be told to keep it, and where that moment, unremarkable, unrecorded, exactly like 10,000 other moments that would come after it, would feel like exactly enough. She had come to Dust Valley with 2 babies and $9 and a man's broken promise and no particular plan for survival beyond the plan to survive. She had not arrived looking for a home. She had not arrived looking for love. She had arrived looking for a foothold, and she had found one. And from that foothold she had built upward in the only direction that made sense. And this was where she stood now, in a field that was going to be a ranch, with a husband who had sat in the dirt of a yard and given her boys his hair to pull, and two sons who were almost 4 and had never in their lives been left anywhere by anyone, and a town 6 miles west that knew her name and her worth in equal measure. She was not the woman who had been left on the platform. She had not been that woman for a long time. What she was now was harder to say in a single sentence, which was fine, because the life she'd built didn't fit in a single sentence either. It was long and specific and still going, and that was exactly as it should be. Not a story with a lesson at the end of it, but a life with more chapters still to write, in a place she had chosen over somewhere easier, on a piece of desert land that was going to grow into something her boys would remember. Owen put the rock in his pocket. They walked back toward the horses in the long light of the afternoon, and Dust Valley waited for them 6 miles west, and the life they had built in it waited too, imperfect and ongoing and entirely, unmistakably theirs.